Recently, beloved former game show host Bob Barker passed away. The star had retired from his nearly 4-decade-long gig hosting The Price is Right in 2007 and spent his remaining years in quiet retirement. Bob's first and only wife passed away in 1981. In Bob's final years, he didn't leave the house at all except to visit her grave. Join Facts Verse as we pay our respects to Bob Barker and take a look inside his final days. Bob Barker was born December 12, 1923 in Darrington, Washington. When Bob was a child, his mother worked as a school teacher at the Rosebud Indian Reservation, which was located in South Dakota. Because of this, Bob spent many of his childhood years on the reservation. He developed a penchant for playing basketball. His talent for the sport allowed him to attain an athletic scholarship, and he continued playing while attending Drury University. In 1943, Barker took a break from his academic studies to join the U.S. Navy Reserve. Although he had intended to defend his country as a fighter pilot, he never ended up seeing active duty. After World War II ended, Bob came back to America and resumed his studies. The future game show host graduated from Drury with a degree in economics, which would prove fitting for his role on The Price is Right. Though Bob Barker studied economics in college, he also made his official entryway into the entertainment industry during his college years by taking a job with a local radio station, KTTS-FM radio. Bob enjoyed working on the radio and aspired to become a radio star after graduating college. In 1945, Bob had married first and only wife, Dorothy Jo Gideon. The two remained married until her death in 1981, and Bob never remarried. Together they moved to California in 1950 so Bob could try to make it in the entertainment industry. In California, Bob found continued success on radio. Before long, he was given a gig hosting his own self-titled radio program titled The Bob Barker Show. He went on to host that for 6 years, and it was this gig that eventually saw him swept up by TV producers to become an iconic game show host. Around the time Bob was hosting his own show, there was a popular game show on TV called Truth or Consequences. The show had recently lost its host, and the producers were looking for a replacement. One day, one of the producers tuned in to the Bob Barker Show and decided the host's voice would be perfect for a game show. In 1956, Bob was officially hired on as the host of Truth or Consequences. He began hosting it in 1956. Bob continued hosting the program for nearly 2 decades. During his tenure as host of Truth or Consequences, Bob also became the host of a new and revamped version of a game show called The Price is Right, the original version of which had premiered the same year as Truth or Consequences. CBS had a lot of faith in Bob Barker, and they were adamant that the new version of The Price is Right needed to feature him as its host. But the producers of The Price is Right had other ideas, and they wanted to hire an entertainer named Dennis James. Bob didn't want to cause trouble, so he suggested he be given another game show to host instead of The Price is Right, so Dennis James could be the host of the revamped game show. But CBS wouldn't budge in their insistence that he needed to host The Price is Right. This insistence paid off, as it's hard to imagine anyone besides Bob Barker being the host of that show. He went on to serve as The Price is Right's host for nearly 4 decades. He began hosting it in 1972 and ended his tenure hosting Truth or Consequences in 1975. From then on, Bob Barker has remained most famously remembered as the host of The Price is Right. It wasn't until 35 years after taking the job that the host finally retired at age 84. Hey, if you're enjoying this video so far, be sure to give it a like and subscribe to Factsverse if you haven't already, and stick around for more about Bob Barker. Throughout Bob Barker's nearly 4-decade tenure hosting The Price is Right, audiences got to watch the game show host grow into his old age. By the time he retired, he was already well into his 80s. By the time of his recent death, he was nearly 100. Bob Barker had started out his gig hosting The Price is Right with brown hair, but that started to turn gray in the late 80s. He was initially a little insecure about it turning gray, but he ended up accepting it and allowed his gray hair to be shown to the public. Before this, most game show hosts had made a habit of dyeing their hair when they grayed. Showing gray hair on television wasn't considered dignified, but Bob Barker felt the opposite. According to him, he felt leaning into his new gray hair showed he was aging with grace. Bob initially tried to dye his hair to keep up with the trends, but he found that all the dyes he used made his hair look blue instead of brown. Finally, he showed up after a lengthy vacation and his hair was completely gray. All the crew members claimed Bob looked better than ever with his gray hair, and he never dyed it again. According to Bob Barker, showing his gray hair apparently boosted the ratings. A few years after going gray, Bob Barker took on his very first film role in the Adam Sandler comedy Happy Gilmore. His role in the film introduced him to a new generation, and many people still remember his performance just as fondly as they do his tenure as host. Bob would go on to continue hosting Price is Right until 2007 when he officially retired. It was in 2006 that he announced his plans to retire, and he made good on that promise the following year. In the years leading up to his death, over a decade later, Bob lived a life of relative peace and quiet. His wife had passed away in 1981, and he never had any children. Towards his final days, it was said he never left the house except to visit his wife's grave. The producers of The Price is Right had a tough time finding someone to replace him, and they ended up deciding on TV star Drew Carey. Drew's time as host has proved successful, though no one could truly replace Bob Barker. Drew Carey was said to be one of the few visitors that the former game show host would get during the final years of his life. After his retirement, Bob made sporadic cameos on The Price is Right to remind audiences he was still alive and kicking, but these became increasingly disparate as his health got worse. He celebrated his 98th birthday in 2021. In the later years of his life, Bob reportedly suffered from several health problems due to his increasingly old age. He was certainly healthier than the average 100-year-old in the years leading up to his death, and the star liked to credit his relatively good health to his vegetarian diet. Still, he had to go eventually. Some of the many health problems Bob had to deal with later in life included skin cancer, a stroke, heart issues, and having to undergo prostate surgery. The former game show host also began suffering from falls later on, having been hospitalized on 2 separate occasions in 2018 as a result. He was said to have spent many of his last years in increased isolation due to COVID-19, but it was apparently his choice to live his last days away from the public spotlight so he could die with dignity. At the time of the beloved former game show host's passing, he was reported to have been worth around $70 million. Now it's time to hear from you. What's your favorite memory of Bob Barker? Let us know in the comment section below. And before you go, make sure you give this video a like and subscribe to FactsVerse if you haven't already. Click the bell icon to stay updated on all our latest content.